In November of 2018, parents of students at a small private school received a letter sent home in their kids' backpacks at the end of the school day. But this letter wasn't about a field trip. Instead, it revealed that the principal and vice principal of the school had been involved in the personal use of a substantial amount of school funds. The news hit those parents like a freight train, not just because two officials had made off with what was then estimated to be about $500,000, but also because those officials were highly respected and deeply trusted Catholic nuns. Let me say first off, nobody dies in this one, so you guys that need a murder might be a little disappointed. But hey, there's other crimes out there like embezzlement, which is what we're dealing with today. Also, I got my hair cut halfway through making this and I didn't shoot in order, so yeah, don't get distracted by it. Let's get past it. This is Torrance, California. It's kind of my adopted hometown. I used to have an antique store right here before I moved into the bus, and I try to spend some time here pretty much every year. Torrance is a city that straddles two worlds. Parts of it feel like you're basically in a big shopping mall, and other parts, like downtown, are quaint and charming and have this like small town Mayberry kind of feel. It's adjacent to Redondo Beach, which is more of a typical California beach town, but there's a lot of crossover. A lot of people live in one city and work in the other. One institution that also crosses over with property in both cities is St. James Church. The first St. James Church was built in Redondo Beach in 1914. The original parish school opened in 1918 with a tuition of $1 per month. The school was adjacent to the church and was run by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet, which is the same order that our thieving nuns belong to many years later. This is the current church building. It's a mid-century modern marvel that incorporates interesting nautical touches, a reflection of the proximity to the ocean, which is just a few blocks away. It's a beautiful church with huge, spectacular stained glass windows, some of which are going to feel kind of ironic once we get further into this story. The church was dedicated in June of 1961. 1961 was the same year that the parish had a blue chip stamp drive to buy the Sisters of St. Joseph their very first car. It was a light blue Ford station wagon. Wait do you see what cars the nuns are driving later on. From the 60s to the 90s, the school operated as two separate campuses, one adjacent to the church and the other called the Annex in Torrance. Then a decision was made to move all the classes to the Annex. In 1990, as the school moved to its new digs, a new principal also came along, Sister Mary Margaret Kruper. And I'm going to pronounce it Kruper because that's what every report I've seen has done, except this guy.
Sister Mary Margaret Nuper says,
not sure where he got Nuper. She had previously been the principal at St. Stanislaus Catholic School in Lewiston, Idaho from 1970 to 1981. In the gap between Idaho and Torrance, she taught 4th grade at St. Patrick's in Pasco, Washington, and 5th at Our Lady of Las Vegas, which is something to remember as things progress. Now, I'm not an expert on the internal hierarchy of the Sisters of St. Joseph, but doesn't that seem like a demotion? Going from principal to 4th grade teacher, was that a voluntary return to the classroom, or was it a quiet way to move a problem principal without causing a scandal? You know, one of those lateral moves that the church is kind of famous for? It's the sort of zigzag on a resume that usually suggests there's a story there that no one is telling. Okay, I'm just pointing it out because it seems like it could be some kind of a red flag. I don't know. As a young girl, Mary Margaret Kruper attended the all-girls St. Mary's Academy run by the Sisters of St. Joseph, the same order that she would enter at the age of 18 right out of high school. She didn't so much join the sisters as she was raised by them. Mary Margaret entered in 1959 or 1960 during a time of upheaval and change. At that point, women were probably still self-flagellating and wearing full habits, but then came the Second Vatican Council in 1962, convened by Pope John XXIII, with the goal of making the church more accessible to the average person. Even if you're not Catholic, you've probably heard about this, because this is when the Mass went from Latin to English, a move that would later seriously piss off Mel Gibson. By the time Mary Margaret said her full perpetual vows a few years later, a lot had changed. The most visible change, of course, was the evolution of the habit, which got less cumbersome and eventually disappeared completely. But underneath that, there was a much bigger shift toward autonomy, which included things like learning to drive, governing their own communities, and managing their own finances. Many sisters became very involved in social justice at that time, while a lot of others, like 90,000 others across the whole church, left their orders altogether. Mary Margaret got her bachelor's at Mount St. Mary's University, also founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph. I don't know exactly how she felt about all this change, but she stayed through it. She stayed in the field of education, which that was the traditional occupation for the Sisters of St. Joseph, but almost all of her peers left to serve in other ways as soon as the opportunity was presented. By 1990, there were almost no nuns teaching in Catholic schools anymore, but Sister Mary Margaret stayed. Still, she doesn't seem to have been a traditionalist. At 47, when she took over St. James School, she had definitely embraced a life of freedom out in the community, especially that part about finances. In 1996, Kruper hired Sister Lana Chang to teach 8th grade. The two had met at St. Stanislaus. Sister Lana was 10 years younger, with about 25 years of teaching experience. She was definitely well qualified for the job, with a master's from Loyola Marymount, but Sister Mary Margaret might have hired her for maybe a different reason. The two women were often described, at least after she came to Torrance, as best friends. At some point, Sister Lana was made vice principal, though I'm not sure exactly when that happened. The two of them shared a townhouse near the school. I'm told that it was possibly in this complex, but you know, there's a lot of complexes around here that look very similar, so pick one. The Sisters of St. Joseph owned the condo, but I have a feeling Sister Mary Margaret had a lot of input into its selection. The two of them lived a life that seemed a little weird for two ladies that had taken a vow of poverty. Each of them drove a late model Volvo, for example, which they both would drive to school every day, even though they were coming from the same place and going to the same place. No carpool for these ladies. It wasn't super unusual for the two women to be sharing a home since they were the only two nuns teaching at the school. But it was kind of unusual for them to be constantly taking vacations together, most of them to places with casinos. Las Vegas, Tahoe, the Pechanga Casino in Temecula, the sisters visited them all, and they didn't really hesitate to talk about it. The trips did raise a few eyebrows, but I think most of the parents thought, well, who am I to tell a nun how to live a vow of poverty? The story said that Sister Lana had a rich uncle, and he picked up the cost of these trips. He was apparently the source of the cars as well. I like to picture the sisters in here in full nun outfit, like head to foot, black and white, the whole penguin outfit, the full habit, just sitting at a slot machine, pulling the lever and going, whee! But, I know that that's not accurate because number one, they didn't wear habits, like not even at work, let alone here in a casino. Number two, slot machines don't have an arm anymore. But, this whole part is like, this is a fantasy. There's no facts in this part, okay? There were other red flags, though, if anybody had been looking, like Sister Mary Margaret's unusual prowess with poker, which she demonstrated at fundraising casino nights that took in wads and wads and wads of cash. Cash that, like at most school fundraisers, seemed to be very loosely accounted for. She also seemed to win at least one major prize at every school raffle, and she showed extraordinary interest in certain sporting events, as if she had personal stakes in the NFL, because maybe she did.
It is caught by Tyree.
I think most parents probably thought of her as eccentric. And look, there's something kind of cool about that. The nuns worked really hard. There's no denying that. And if they needed a little break every now and then, nobody was really going to call them on it. They seemed truly to put school and the students first. And the parents were, for the most part, happy with the way she ran the school. Students had a little more of a divided opinion on the subject, I think. Sister Mary Margaret ran a tight ship, at least as far as students were concerned. She disliked children speaking out of turn or cluttering up their desks. Youthful enthusiasm was kind of seen as chaos to her, and accidental happenings like kicking a ball over a fence were grounds for punishment. And she had a favorite punishment. It was walking the line, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, walking a line that's painted in a square on the pavement. She also apparently cried poverty a lot. Kids ate lunch outside on bleachers in the sun, and some of the parents wanted to put up an awning. But Sister Mary Margaret said, well, there's no money. Where's that supposed to come from? There's no money to do that. One father spoke on the Opportunist podcast about coaching football and trying to get by without uniforms or safety equipment or even an actual football. In 2018, Sister Mary Margaret Kruper decided that it was time for her to retire. After all, she'd been at St. James for 28 years by then. Sister Lana announced shortly after that she'd be retiring too. Plans were made to transition the school into new hands. One of the last letters that Sister Mary sent home to parents went out that March. In it, she announced a tuition increase that was to cover the extra money that the school was going to have to pay out for her and Sister Lana's replacements. She said, "You may already know that I do not receive a salary for my services as principal of St. James School. As a member of a religious community, I receive a stipend for my work. The same is true for Sister Lana. The budget will be impacted by the extra salaries next year." Right around then, the two of them put a $7,000 deposit down on a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. That same year, in the gap between the retirement announcement and the shit hitting the fan, the parish posted a video celebrating the 100th anniversary of St. James School. Of course, it had a prominently featured section on Sister Mary Margaret, whose stern but gentle hand had guided the organization for so many years.
Sister Mary Margaret was a wonderful boss, I'll tell you.
Sister Mary Margaret came at a time where we desperately needed somebody to be willing to take on a big task.
And then also on a personal level, if we were having something going on in our personal life, we could go to her and ask for some guidance.
Sister Mary Margaret allowed me to just be who I was.
I think of Sister Mary Margaret as kind of your favorite aunt.
It really struck me watching this how trusted and beloved she was. It just makes what happened a few months later kind of heartbreaking. Standard operating procedure required that a routine audit be conducted when a principal or other important person stepped down and another came on board. It doesn't seem like the two nuns really thought through what was going to happen with that. Maybe they just got cocky. They had managed to pull the whole thing off for at least a decade, probably longer. How did they pull it off? Well, here's the basic idea. There was a bank account opened in 1997 in the St. James Parishioners Credit Union, which is right here. It was designed to cover the expenses of the nuns who taught at the school. This was the St. James Convent account. All the church's other accounts were in a regular commercial bank. I'm not sure which one, but it just, some other bank. The convent account should have been used to pay for groceries, household expenses, and the stipends that the sisters received. That's what it was for. But as the account's sole signer, Sister Mary Margaret turned it into her personal slush fund. All checks coming into the school would first be handled by Sister Mary Margaret, who would endorse them with a stamp on the back. And the checks that went into school coffers were stamped with the normal deposit stamp from the commercial bank the rest of the church's accounts were in, while the ones that were funneled to the slush fund were stamped with a secret convent account stamp that Sister Mary Margaret kept in her desk. Bogus monthly and annual reports hid the fraudulent activity. To cover for tuition checks that ended up in the wrong bank, she would mark those students as recipients of a hardship scholarship, meaning that they were listed basically on the books as charity cases when they had actually paid their tuition in full. Because she was the principal and a nun, nobody ever second-guessed her. Oh, and that was only one of the frauds the nuns pulled off. They also ran a script scam. As a fundraiser, the school would buy these gift cards at a discount and then sell them to the parents at full face value. But see, since she controlled the physical inventory of gift cards, Sister Mary could sell a $100 card for $100 cash, give the parent the card, and then never log that the card was missing from the stack. It's like a bartender selling a drink and never ringing it up on the till, just pocketing the money instead. They might have gotten away with all this, except as part of the handoff audit, a few irregularities were spotted in the tuition records, and Sister Mary Margaret started scrambling to cover her tracks. Among other things, she instructed the school's office staff to shred old tuition ledgers she said it was to save space, which didn't really sit well with the workers, so they were kind of on alert. The auditors, meanwhile, generated a list of all the accounts associated with the school's tax ID number, and for the first time, they became aware of the credit union account. At just about the same time, one of those families that was listed as a hardship scholarship requested a copy of a check for their records, and the school's office staff didn't have a check to give them because why would a scholarship family even have written a check? When the family came back to them with a digital image from their own bank and the staffers saw what account it had been deposited to, they alerted the Monsignor. And now we're back to where we started, at the November 2018 letter to the parents. Monsignor Michael Myers, no relation to the fictional killer from the Halloween movies, he had been the pastor at St. James Church since 2011, so it was his job to break the news. He's the one who wrote the letter. In it, he gently broke the news about what the sisters had been up to. Despite the fact that they'd stolen what back then looked like about $500,000, he said, "No student or program at St. James has suffered any loss of educational resources, opportunities, or innovations. In sum, the education of your children has not and will not be affected by these events." Yeah, how could that possibly be true? $500,000 is gone. Nobody was affected? No, parents didn't buy that. About a week after the letter went home, a meeting was held by the Archdiocese. At the meeting, parents and alumni demanded to know where the money was, whether it was retrievable, what it had been spent on. The answer coming from the Archdiocese attorney was, "We do know that they had a pattern of going on trips. We do know that they had a pattern of going to casinos." So yeah, the reality is they used the account as their personal account. In other words, the nuns had gambled the money away, and the whole thing had been happening for a minimum of 10 years. But don't worry, Myers said, they felt a deep remorse and were asking for forgiveness and prayers. As far as punishment goes, the church would be handling that internally, of course. The plan was for church auditors to investigate, for the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet to make restitution to the Archdiocese, and for Sister Mary and Sister Lana to be punished with canonical sanctions. That's basically equal to a very strict probation, but of course it's probation without actual probation. It would keep them from ending up with criminal records. As part of the sanctions, the women had been removed from all public ministry and sent to separate convents. They had been split up like a couple of troublemaking friends in the classroom. So there you go. The good old Catholic Church shoving things under the rug for the sake of appearances again. It must be pretty hard to walk on that rug with all those lumps. Some of the parents were forgiving, but most of them were livid. They leaked recordings of the meeting to the press and demanded that the police be brought in and that charges be pressed. The Monsignor told the parish that Torrance PD had been notified, but because the nuns had said they were sorry and the order had agreed to pay restitution, the Archdiocese was not interested in pursuing criminal charges. And that, the Monsignor thought, would be the end of that. Unfortunately for the church, bank fraud is a federal offense. Pretty soon the FBI and the IRS were involved. Up till then, Sister Mary Margaret had admitted only to some vague misappropriation of funds, maintaining that though she had taken a small amount for personal use, the bulk of the money that switched over to the convent account was money that she had put in a rainy day fund. Money that she was holding in reserve to be funneled back into school programs. The church was only too happy to accept that explanation because it meant that they didn't really have to look into things too deeply. The FBI was a different story. They subpoenaed the nuns' casino club card records. These are cards that record every minute that a player is on a machine, how much they buy in for, their average bet, their total wins and losses. Sister Mary Margaret's main jam was video poker, where a good player can cycle through 600, 800 hands an hour without having to wait for a dealer to shuffle. The FBI's accountants compared money spent on the machines to money withdrawn from the convent account at ATMs either inside of or within 1 mile of casinos. That cross-reference made it clear that there was no rainy day fund. The account balance fluctuated in direct sync to their gambling trips. The reserve wasn't spent on school roofs and textbooks, it was churned through poker machines. Then Sister Mary Margaret pivoted and said that she was actually owed the money she stole because of gender pay disparity within the church. Priests were paid more than nuns, she said, simply because they were male, and she was just righting a systemic wrong. You can imagine how well that went over. By the time it was all added up, the take would total just over $835,000.
A nun is facing decades in prison. She's admitted in court to stealing almost $1 million from a Southland Catholic school. Sister Mary Margaret Newber says she stole the money from a Torrance school to feed a gambling habit.
Mary Margaret Cooper, not Newper, pleaded guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of money laundering. In exchange for the plea, federal prosecutors agreed to recommend a 24-month sentence, which is much better than the 40 years she could have been eligible for. But the actual sentencing would be up to U.S. District Judge Otis D. Wright II. Wright is a Bush-era appointee, born in Tuskegee, Oklahoma in 1944, making him about 76, 77 at the time of the sentencing, not far behind Mary Margaret. He's a Marine Corps veteran who previously served as a deputy sheriff in LA County. In his judicial career, he was deputy assistant attorney for the state of California, and now he's a judge of the United States District Court for the Central District of California. In that role, he's presided over some high-profile trials like a breach of contract case against Smokey Robinson, where the judge apparently had people rolling in the aisles with his strange asides. He's definitely not one to mince words.
Shut up! You think that wipes the slate clean for what you've done?
But the most significant part of Wright's biography, for this case anyway, is that he was raised Catholic and educated by nuns. In January of 2022, when it was time for sentencing, courthouses in Los Angeles were back on COVID protocols due to the Omicron variant. Remember that? So instead of appearing in Judge Wright's courtroom, Mary Margaret only had to show up on Zoom. By then, lots of former St. James students and parents had sent private letters to Judge Wright. Some came to the hearing via Zoom and made remarks. Almost all of them asked the judge to lock Sister Mary Margaret up. When it was her turn to speak, Cooper looked into the camera and said that she was profoundly sorry. "I have sinned. I have broken the law. And I have no excuses," she said. Her crimes were a violation of my vows, the commandments, the law, and above all, the sacred trust that so many had placed in me. Judge Wright's background as a Catholic, and as someone whose life, he said, had been changed by a nun, put him in a unique position. He could see how the treachery of her betrayal had affected those who trusted her, but at the same time, his obvious reverence for her vocation, not to mention her advancing age, left him really struggling. Judge Wright said, "I haven't slept well in God knows how long." Then he put his face in his hands and was silent for a very long time. Finally, he lifted his head and pronounced the sentence. 1 year and 1 day. I've always wondered about that year and a day thing. You've probably heard that sentence before. When a judge gives a sentence of a year and a day, particularly if it's a federal judge, it's actually a show of mercy. Certain privileges don't kick in unless your sentence is over 1 year. For example, on a sentence of 1 year or less, you're not eligible for the 54 days that can potentially be deducted for good conduct. This means that somebody who's sentenced to 366 days, a year and a day, could theoretically get out of prison in about 10 months, while somebody who gets 365 days straight, a year, is probably going to serve that entire year-long sentence. The other door the extra day opens is the possibility of being sent to a more favorable facility, like a federal prison camp, while somebody with a straight 1-year sentence might end up just getting held in a local jail. Local jail is not where you want to be doing your time, believe me. Don't ask me how I know. Mary Margaret Cooper surrendered to the Bureau of Prisons on June 7, 2022. The court, that is Judge Wright, recommended that she be designated to the Victorville satellite camp. I'd love to have gone there for you, but sorry, I couldn't fit Victorville into the schedule, so you're just going to have to make do with this ad for a Victorville inmate consultant. Who knew there was such a thing? It's a minimum security federal detention center for about 300 nonviolent female offenders. So minimum security that in 2019 and 2020, 5 women escaped by just walking away. Records from the Bureau of Prisons show an out-of-custody date for Mary Margaret of February 14th, 2023. That's about 8 months and 1 week. Most likely, she continued on home confinement for 2 more months, putting her official release from custody in April of 2023, followed by a 2-year period of federally supervised release. That supervision ended in 2025. So where is she now? You might recognize this if you're a fan of the TV show American Horror Story. This is the murder house from season 1. It's a popular stop for local murder tours like the one in the limo in front of me. It also used to belong to the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet. They lived there for quite a long time, and they moved out in 1994 because the Northridge earthquake cracked the foundation of the building. It looks like somebody lives there now. There's a couple of cars in the driveway. But there's like broken stained glass windows and stuff. There's a light on the first floor. So if somebody's living there, they're pretty much only living, looks like, on that first floor. The murder house is across the street from the Province Center, which is a retirement home for elderly Sisters of St. Joseph. That's where Sister Mary Margaret lives now, under the close supervision of the order that paid both literally and figuratively for her sins. The restitution that was paid on her behalf came from the combined retirement and healthcare funds of all the sisters. It's ironic that with Kruper's claims about gender disparity, a group of women are the ones who sacrificed to make things right and to settle her debt. And what about Sister Lana? Well, she was never charged with anything. There's no question that she was complicit. She's referred to in the court documents as individual one, but it's pretty clear that it's her. Basically, she's an unindicted co-conspirator, but she was probably never hands-on with the money the way Sister Mary was. I think it's significant, though, that all of the thievery seems to have begun in 1997 when the convent account was opened, and that was only 1 year after the best friends were reunited at St. James. I've read that Sister Lana now lives a quiet life of contemplation, which, to be fair, is what I always kind of imagined that nuns would be doing anyway. She's most likely at the order's other house, their main property, because, of course, these two, they have to be kept apart, because there's no telling what kind of trouble they'd be getting into if they were together. As for St. James School, it bounced back. They even have umbrellas over the lunch tables now. That bounce was definitely helped by a hefty settlement of over $1 million from the parish's insurance company, probably on an employee dishonesty bond claim, and $300,000 from the Sisters of St. Joseph. It's not the full amount of restitution ordered by the court, but that's a lot. The money they gave to St. James School was earmarked to pay for future long-term tuition needs, so it's like the real hardship scholarship. With that fund and the insurance money, the school really basically came out ahead, but none of that probably makes a big difference to the families whose faith was shattered and whose trust was abused.
And this new controversy in part may be tied to the last controversy in a big insurance payment that came from that scandal.
The gambling nun story was not the last controversy to put St. James in the news. Here are parents and students picketing and demanding transparency after the firing of a popular assistant principal.
We know that the school was given a settlement and we're not receiving any of that money. The assistant principal who was fired was one of the people who were asking those tough questions.
Seemed like somebody didn't learn much of a lesson from the handling of that last scandal. But things have been pretty quiet for a couple of years now. The new principal is not a nun. He's not any kind of clergy. He's just a guy with a solid career in school administration. Not as fun as an eccentric old sister who knows the football spread, but probably a little safer.
As a sister of St. Joseph of Carondelet, I'm proud and honored to have been a part of the leadership at St. James School for more than a quarter of those 100 years.
What I wonder about that eccentric old sister is, was this side of her always in there, or did she go through some sort of midlife or maybe late life crisis, because I've heard of people who married young, who married their high school sweetheart, and then one day they wake up and they're like, I never got to sow my wild oats. I never dated anybody else. What did I do to myself? Mary Margaret married Jesus when she was just 18. Maybe she got FOMO and then fell down a well of addiction and couldn't get out. Or maybe it was just too much fun, trading a life of contemplation for the adrenaline of crime and poker. Well, that's the story of the gambling nuns, what I know about it anyway. I'm Mary, not Mary Margaret, just Mary. I live in this little bus with my little dog, and my plan, what I'm aiming for, though I didn't quite succeed this time, is to post a new true crime documentary from the road about once a month. Thanks for riding along on this one, and I will see you on the next True Crime Travel Time, where the forgotten story is the map.